A large proportion of Eastern European Jews settled in New York City. Many of these immigrants worked in the clothing industry, often in dirty and dangerous workplaces. But more quickly than other immigrant groups, Jews managed to gain footholds in the professions. Committed to staying and succeeding in the United States, Jewish immigrants placed a high premium on education, encouraging their children to attend high school and college. As early as the 1920s, the numbers of Jewish students at American colleges and universities greatly exceeded their percentage of the total population, so much so that some elite colleges like Harvard and Yale began limiting the number of Jews they would accept for admission. Immigrant children at work. To help make ends meet, the children of immigrants typically held full-time jobs in factories or family businesses. One immigrant recalled of his childhood, "When you work, you understand, you used to bring your pay home and give it to your parents. Bring our pay at home, and whatever it was, we would make do." In 1910, in Chicago and Cleveland, less than a tenth of all Italian, Polish, and Slavic children were able to go to school past the 6th grade. For these children and their families, it was a matter not of choice but of survival. Establishing ethnic communities. New arrivals often settled near friends and family members already living in the United States. Many Germans and Scandinavians headed to the upper Midwest, while many Japanese immigrants traveled to the farmlands of California. Some ethnic groups followed even more specific patterns of settlement. Poles moved from Gdansk, Poland, to Polish Hill and Pittsburgh, following the path taken earlier by their aunts, uncles, and cousins. Some Italians found work together in coal mines in southern Illinois, and when that work ran out, they moved to the Italian neighborhood in St. Louis, Missouri. By 1910, 500,000 Jews lived in a 1.5 square mile neighborhood in New York City called the Lower East Side. In this area, different blocks housed Jews from distinct regions of Russia, and sometimes from individual cities called shtetls, as European Jews called the small towns they came from. In the second wave of immigrations, most of the new arrivals crowded into cities. At one point, 1/6 of the population of Manhattan Island in New York City was packed into the Lower East Side. In 1920, New York City had 400,000 Italian immigrants, nearly a quarter of all those who came to the country. Chicago, with 9% of its population Swedish American, had the second largest Swedish population of any city in the world by 1900. Immigrants from beyond Europe. Not all the new immigrants to the United States came from Europe. The century of immigration also saw a surge in newcomers from China and Japan. The Chinese and Japanese differed from other immigrant groups in two important ways. They came across the Pacific Ocean to the west coast rather than across the Atlantic to the eastern cities, and their Asian origins made them especially subject to discrimination. About 300 Chinese arrived in America between 1848 and 1882. Among the first people who came to seek wealth in the 1849 California gold rush were 325 arrivals from China. They were pulled by the hope of striking it rich and pushed by political unrest and poverty at home. Thousands more, almost all men, soon followed. When the mining boom ended, many Chinese immigrants remained in the West, where they became railroad workers and helped build the first transcontinental lines in the 1860s. Chinese immigrants often took jobs that many native-born whites did not want, such as laying railroad tracks, mining, cooking, and doing laundry at mining camps. The hardworking immigrants were often feared as outsiders competing for scarce jobs, and bloody riots sometimes broke out with white workers attacking the Chinese. The immigrants responded by building tight-knit community organizations and pooling money to help each other start businesses. The hub of their community was the several tightly packed blocks of San Francisco known as Chinatown. Japanese immigrants began coming to the United States in significant numbers in the 1890s. Before that, many Japanese had left their country for Hawaii, where they became agricultural workers. When the United States annexed Hawaii in 1898, the Japanese began migrating to the American mainland in search of new opportunities. Compared to Chinese immigrants, many Japanese brought up more startup capital with which to establish farms and stores. Nevertheless, because of their Asian origins and their different customs, they suffered, like the Chinese, from widespread discrimination. In addition to the immigrants from Europe and Asia, some 750,000 Mexicans came to the United States in the early decades of the 20th century. At the close of the Mexican-American War in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had turned thousands of Mexican citizens into residents of the United States. Other Mexicans headed north in search of agricultural work, especially after a revolution in 1909 led to an economic and political disruption at home. Ports of arrival. Most immigrants first stepped onto American soil at one of three locations: Castle Garden or Ellis Island in New York, or Angel Island in San Francisco. These were processing centers where government officials collected information about the immigrants and decided that they qualified to enter the United States. Castle Garden, an old stone fortress on Manhattan Island, New York, was the country's first official immigration center. Between 1855 and 1890, more than 8 million people entered the United States through this facility. But Castle Garden could not accommodate the large numbers arriving by the by the late 19th century. In 1892, the federal government opened a new facility at Ellis Island in New York Harbor. Over the next 40 years, some 12 million immigrants were processed at Ellis Island. About another 5 million immigrants, mainly those traveling first and second class and presumed to be suitable for entry, were quickly examined on board their ships and allowed to enter the country without going through processing on the island. For many immigrants, their first glimpse of America was the Statue of Liberty, which stood a short distance away in New York Harbor. Emerging from dank and crowded steerage compartments deep in the hulls of their ships, immigrants, sometimes thousands per day, gathered their few belongings and traveled by ferry to the great receiving hall on Ellis Island. There, immigration agents gave them a physical examination and recorded their age, nationality, and marital status. Sometimes agents would shorten or simplify foreign names that they found too difficult to spell. Immigrants would feel lost and confused at Ellis Island. One woman arriving from Russia in 1911 recalled, "We had no idea where we were going and no idea what was to be done to us. There were hundreds and hundreds of people and they were treated exactly like sheep." Most immigrants left Ellis Island the same day they arrived. Limited lodging and food were provided for those who had to stay overnight, as well as a hospital on the island for those too ill to proceed. Most immigrants processed at Ellis Island were granted admission to the United States. Ellis Island became known as the Island of Hope, though for those who were turned back it was an island of tears. An 1891 law required immigration agents to reject anyone who had been convicted of a serious crime, as well as the insane and people with contagious diseases. Fiora LaGuardia, a native-born American who worked as an interpreter at Ellis Island, later became one of New York City's most successful mayors, recalled that many immigrants were excluded because they suffered from a serious eye disease called trachoma. "Sometimes," said LaGuardia, "if it was a young child who suffered from trachoma, one of the parents had to return to their native country with the rejected member of the family. When they learned their fate, they were stunned. But for the great majority, Ellis Island proved a brief stopover on the way to a new life in America. The West Coast equivalent of Ellis Island was Angel Island in San Francisco Bay. It operated from 1910 until 1940. Unlike Ellis Island, where officials attempted to process millions of European immigrants with minimal interference, Angel Island was a far less welcoming place." Reflecting the widespread bias against Chinese and Japanese citizens, the Angel Island staff sought to reject as many potential immigrants as possible. More than 175,000 Chinese immigrants passed through the island. Most had to remain there for 2 to 3 weeks, and many were turned back. Many of the temporary residents of Angel Island scratched poems and messages on the walls of the fortress as a record of their anxiety and anguish. One immigrant wrote, "I used to admire the land of the flowery flag as a country of abundance. I immediately raised money and started my journey. For over a month I have experienced wind and waves. I look up and see Oakland so close by. Discontent fills my belly, and it is difficult for me to sleep. I just write these lines to express what is on my mind."